Hey Joseph, thanks for your work in week 9. I wanted to loop back to what you've written about the rhetorical force of chapter 11. I'm not sure that you had a chance to listen to the podcast or read what I've written about that, but I want to try to um, highlight something in there that I think is easily overlooked about this key sort of concluding section of Paul's argument of Romans 9 to 11. Um, of course, as you remember from last week, I think it's important to keep in mind that throughout Romans 9 to 11, he's not just writing generically about Israel in general or speculating about Israel. He's writing about the specific relatives, members of the Jewish family that he invokes and expresses grief over in the opening verses of chapter 9, and is then sort of teaching the audience how God's election has shaped the family of Israel over generations, so that when we get to chapter 11, he is landing his argument by advocating for these relatives of his that God has not repudiated them, that God has not disowned them, that in fact their sort of hostility to the audience is something the audience should understand in terms of God's hardening rather than something they should be blaming Paul's relatives for. And that, as you said here, in fact, it will culminate this work of God in the salvation of all Israel. By implication, I think clearly including these hardened relatives of Paul's that have become enemies of the audience in Rome. So when Paul talks about branches being broken off, I think it's crucial to kind of track carefully the rhetoric of that part of the argument. The image here is not of branches being sort of severed clean off of the tree of the people of God, but as in standard grafting practice of the day, branches being broken um, open from the trunk or the flesh of the tree enough that a foreign wild branch of another tree could be grafted into that open wound between the branch and the trunk, and then sort of twine would be tied around then the two branches to sort of encourage them to both grow together back fully into the trunk of the tree. So that's the image that Paul's talking about. And I don't think it would make much sense for Paul to say simply that, um, some of the tree might have been broken off, but it's their fault anyway because they didn't believe. When he introduces this breaking off and its relationship to faith, it's with a view to impressing upon the audience, yes, they have been broken open, as it were, from the tree, and it is through their faithlessness that this has happened. But Paul's point is not that that is what sort of justifies it, but instead that it is not a final word over these people, and that if anything, it should promote fear in the audience. Because if these natural branches were subject to this kind of breaking through faithlessness, how much more you, he says to the audience of Gentile background, being wild branches, will also be broken through your faithlessness. So I don't think it's a static picture, right, of which branches are in and which branches are out. Do they meet the condition of faith or do they not? That's an understandable way to come away from the passage, but it doesn't really track very well with the argument and the concerns that Paul has in it. So just something to think through there on that section of Romans 9 to 11. And of course, it spills into chapter 12 in terms of the kind of mutuality, long suffering, mutual investment that characterizes the body of the Messiah, that is the life of this hope of the people of God that has informed what Paul's been saying about um, the sort of certainty, the sureness of God's purpose with all of Israel, including even the branches that have been broken along the way. Thanks again for your work in week 9.